Welcome to Polaris-Live, conversations on the U.S.-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. The upcoming United States presidential elections are being called the most important signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policies in a generation. Throughout this autumn, we'll invite a select group of international experts to offer their views on the American elections and how countries around the world, especially China, are preparing for their outcome. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, and my guest today is Dr. Elina Noor. Elina Noor is a senior fellow in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. Previously, she spent most of her career at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, where she held the position of Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Elina is a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Welcome back to Polaris-Live, Dr. Noor.
Hello again, Sarwar. I still have not gotten my PhD, so I'm just Elina.
Well, you raise your right hand, I'll swear you in.
Excellent, I'll go with that.
I didn't say salam alaikum, so salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam to you, Sarwar.
So, Ms. Noor, the Global South is a phrase that increasingly finds its way in headlines. Some analysts dismiss its importance because it is not a tightly knit grouping of countries. Others believe it is already an influencer in global geopolitics. What's your view?
So I actually agree that the Global South framing can be a little problematic. It sort of flattens the agency of many diverse countries with different priorities. But I think as an idea, it's a convenient shortcut to think about these different countries that are trying to reimagine a global order that is more equitable, more just, and one that is markedly different from the immediate post-World War II framework. That said, I think when we often imagine this Global South vagueness, what often comes to mind first and foremost is the state itself. So an aggregation of varied states. We don't often think about the populations. And this is why I prefer the term global majority, actually, because we think of people rather than the states as an abstract concept. And so this disaggregates somewhat, the billionaires in Singapore, which itself, a lot of Singaporeans will tell you they don't consider their country a global South country. But in China or India, for example, there are these huge income gaps, as you well know, Sarwar.
Right.
And, I think if we talk about the global majority, we can sort of imagine a population or many types of peoples in each of these countries, whether it's India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, as very distinct from the elite classes, whether it's in the policy-making world or whether it's in the business world. And so personally, I prefer the term global majority because we're really grounding the nation down to its people rather than the state in its abstraction.
That's very interesting how you define it, because it does get confusing. Take as an example the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the American-led sanctions by the West on Russia. So it seems to me, after what you've said, it would be more correct to say that the global majority does not support, when you say 80% or whatever it is, the global majority does not support the American-led Western sanctions, right? Is that what you're getting at, as opposed to this loose grouping of countries?
Yes, well, I often think in terms of what do matters, whether it's political matters or technological matters, how do they affect people on the ground? And so when I'm talking about the global majority, I'm thinking, for example, of the ordinary person and how they relate to high-level discussions on AI governance, or the ordinary person in Gaza, how are they relating to all these intractable talks in the UN that doesn't really bring them any
Mm,
change on the ground?
mm,
And so I'm really thinking about the people, the society, the different types of segments of society,
right.
and to me, that's what really matters: how it affects people on the ground, not just policymakers, not just governments, not just industry.
So Malaysia is, of course, a member of many regional organizations, including the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the non-aligned movement, so on. It has a strategic location. It has a diverse economy. So how would you describe its importance as an influencer in, let's call it the global majority?
So I think Malaysia has aspirations of becoming a salient voice in many international affairs. And we've seen different waves of how the Malaysian government and its leaders have sought to influence different topics of international concern. Um, because of domestic dynamics, which have been fairly uneven, or let's say over the last few years, we've seen these levels of influence wax and wane over the last 5 years. And so I think there are ambitions, maybe very modest ambitions, of changing certain courses of action in international affairs. We see the Palestinian issue as one of them, a major constant in foreign policy by the Malaysian elite at international levels. But on other issues, I think the Malaysian leadership has sought to try to catch up. And here I'm thinking of technology in particular, but also on various economic issues. And of course, a lot of it depends on the personality of the leaders, right? So Mahathir Mohamad, for example, was a very assertive, strong voice on the international scene. You've seen some other leaders in Malaysia who have had less of an impact than Mahathir. But then I suppose you could argue that not many people can have as strong an impact as Mahathir Mohamad, generally
Yes.
speaking.
It's well, this leads to a question that I often think about. Malaysia has faced criticism regarding its electoral processes now and then, freedom of the press, civil liberties, but there's no question that Malaysia is a democracy. So, do you think there can be a number of shades of governance that can be labeled democracies, or do you think there is one universal litmus test for what country qualifies as a democracy?
That's a really interesting question, Sarah. One I've often thought about, because when I hear the term democracy, particularly from Western interlocutors, I expect for their conception of democracy to be framed in Western liberal democracy traditions.
Hmm.
And whenever I've heard that, it's always grated on me, right? And I instinctively react. But you bring up a really good point that there are different shades of democracy. Some might be more amenable to others. And I think there are some who would argue that Malaysia is even a properly functioning democracy, depending on who's in power.
Right.
But if we're looking at the processes of democracy, yes, we have elections in Malaysia. We're looking at some of the more substantive elements of democracy. Do the people really have a say in a number of issues? I think depending on which segment of society you speak to, there will be people who will contest that even in Malaysia. You talk to the indigenous peoples, for example, and how much say they have in the logging industry. Well, they would probably contest that they have any say in democratic decisions related to their land and their environment. And so, yes, that's my long way of answering you. There are different degrees of democracy in Malaysia, and certainly in other parts of the world.
Well, I just think it becomes an increasingly important question. because in China they point out, that to the West, that why do you believe you're the only ones who are qualified to label a country a democracy or not a democracy? That our leaders have to run the gauntlet of the Chinese Communist Party before they can rise, in the ranks. And yes, we have some actions that are different from the West. You think they have a point? Because as you know, Polaris-Live is at heart aimed, laser focused on improving relations between China and the United States, which impacts relations on countries around the world. So do you think there's something in what China, the leaders of China say, that we too can call ourselves a democracy?
Certainly, I mean, anybody can call themselves a democracy. Just look at the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? And North Korea. They have democracy in their actual formal name. But, whether or not you believe China to have elements of democracy in their form of governance, I don't think it is valid to argue that only the West represents a democratic example of how governance should be conducted. Because many in the global majority will testify that they have been on the receiving end of some very illiberal, undemocratic practices meted out by the West. And we only have to look not even 2 generations ago, much less 1 generation ago, to see what happened during the Cold War, when people in Southeast Asia really had to bear the brunt of, quote unquote, the fight for democracy. And so now, with all that's going on, particularly in occupied Palestine and especially in Gaza, I think the cloak of democracy has come down for the world to see and really criticize even what democracy means in the Western interpretation. So certainly I think that other definitions of democracy, other descriptions of democracy can be equally valid as the West's.
Let me take a moment, Ms. Noor, to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live is entirely viewer-supported. We'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmiri.com, which is KASHMERI.com, and to our YouTube channel, which is www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really, really does help us. And so now, in America, we are fixated on the upcoming presidential elections, which are now less than a month away. And I wonder how Malaysians are reacting to what is being called, here anyway, the most important U.S. election in generations.
It's interesting, isn't it? Every 4 years, I think we hear that term in the United States, where the presidential elections are just as momentous as the last 4 years. and I think from, and obviously I'm just one Malaysian perspective, we've had an experience of what a Trump presidency might look like. That's not to say a future Trump presidency in a few weeks, if it happens, will essentially be the same. But I think we have an expectation that we did not 4 years ago of how things might run. And so I think, at least from a Malaysian foreign policy standpoint, we have an idea of what U.S. foreign policy will look like if a President Trump were to return to the White House. There is some expectation that if Kamala Harris were to win, then we will see some form of continuity in the White House as the Biden administration. There will certainly be elements of difference, of course, but I think in general, in Malaysia, we have some sort of imagination as to what these two very different White Houses will look like come November. That said, if you ask the ordinary person in Malaysia whether they care about what happens in Washington, D.C., they'll probably say no, because right now there are threats of flooding in different parts of Malaysia. It's rainy season, of course. And with the climate crisis, some of these exigencies are getting even more damaging, more destructive. And so it's really the ordinary bread and butter issues. How am I going to be able to afford to buy groceries in the next few months? How am I going to survive if the flood hits my home? These are some of the on-the-ground issues that are dominating a lot of the discussion in Malaysia right now.
And of course, I imagine the trade issue must loom over many others, right? I mean, Malaysia is starting to position itself as a environmental electrovoltaic batteries and get into that whole economy. Which, so is there a time, you think, to what they think?
Yes, I think Malaysia is slowly starting to position itself as anchoring its economy on the digital and green economies. And so, as you rightly pointed out, it's seeking to position itself further up the value chain of semiconductors, for example, and a number of other green tech elements. But if a President Trump comes back to the White House, I think we can assume that many things will change and that the US will be even more protectionist than it already is on a number of these technological fronts. That said, I think we've already begun to see a number of these nationalist type instincts kick in, even with the Biden administration. I think there will be some anxiety about whether this trend will continue if a President Harris were to come into power in the next few weeks.
Right.
So there is some anticipation about continuing to capitalize on the green tech wave and digital economy wave. And we've seen some of the strategies that the Malaysian government has put forward in this direction. But all of that might be upended depending on who comes into power in the White House.
Well, now listen, in China, there's no doubt in anybody's mind who's going to be the next continuing president for quite a while, right?
Right.
And in view of what you've just said, I'm reminded of the phrase that China is now in this overcapacity mode, where taking EV batteries, for example, they already have double the global demand, and yet they expect to grow the production of these as more than 50%. 50%. That can't really help a country like Malaysia, right, which is increasingly starting to depend on this. So how do you view that? Do you think that it's comparable to the trade restrictions that America is placing and may continue to place? I mean, China's doing more or less the same thing, but in a different way.
Yeah, there are starting to be these concerns about dumping from China because of the production and overproduction and overcapacity on the Chinese side. And I think apart from this whole dumping issue and how it will affect the Malaysian economy, there are also starting to be concerns within Malaysia about how the country might be caught in the whole import restrictions, as well as sanctions regime that Washington has begun to impose on Chinese products.
Right.
So even if Malaysia was to be this other party that China is hoping to continue its exports through, Malaysian companies might fall within the net of some of these restrictions that Washington has cast its net on. And so there are concerns among industry, but those discussions haven't taken off in a large or dramatic manner just yet. A lot of industry and government players in Malaysia, I think, are still taking a wait-and-see approach, still trying to be optimistic about how they might leverage on this US-China competition. But, on the Chinese side, I think I've heard some really interesting analyses, not from within China, but from outside of China, particularly in Washington, about how this overproduction is not really a factor to President Xi, for example. He's concerned about growing the domestic economy. Some would say at all costs. And the spillover effects of that is not really a top priority for him because he's interested in really foot stomping on his legacy. And so that's a whole different discussion that requires a different kind of analysis. So if that's true, then there are different considerations, I think, down the line that Malaysian industry and government players will have to take into account.
So I want to ask you now, I hope you would agree that the relationship between China and America is still fraught, almost daggers drawn.
Yes.
And if you personally were able to get a few minutes individually with the president of China and the president of the United States, and you were able to offer them some words regarding actions they can take to lower the tension between the two countries and to improve their relationship, what would you tell them, Elina?
Well, if I had that privilege and if I were actually listened to, I would encourage both leaders to reinstate exchanges at the scholarly and academic levels. We saw a stop to that, particularly with Fulbright exchanges in 2020 under President Trump. And right after COVID, we saw a stop on exchanges within the scientific community between US and Chinese researchers. And I think a lot of these on-the-ground exchanges really help cement the ties that will carry through countries during difficult times. And unfortunately, with the halting of these types of cooperation and collaboration on things that matter, on education, on scientific research, we're going to see less of a familiarity, less cordial ties, and less knowledge of how just both types of communities in the United States and China operate on a daily basis. And I think just really getting to know someone or a whole community on a working operational level can really make a difference when political ties are fraught.
Well, so now I have to ask you, putting myself, if I may, even though he's much taller than me, President Xi Jinping, if you had told me what you just told me, I would say, well, listen, I hope you're also going to be talking to the American president because, there are thousands of Chinese students in America and there are only 380 or 400 American students in China. So is this largely an American issue?
We've seen a lot of knee-jerk reactions, which have translated into, quite unfortunately, policy decisions from Washington. And so I would say that if the new president in the White House steps up and becomes the bigger person, so to speak, and extends that hand of cooperation again, then I expect that the Chinese will welcome that warming of ties once again. So yes, I do think that a lot of the blame lies on the US side. I'm not sure that we're going to see a dialing down of those frosty approaches from Washington, regardless of whoever returns or whoever becomes president in the White House. And so if that's the case, then maybe the Chinese need to extend their hand in the hopes that the US will reciprocate.
Right. It's a lot of people, I'm going to push you a little more on this. A lot of people say, that this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy in China, where if there's a slight push from the American side, the Chinese just react like a sumo wrestler to flatten the landscape, that maybe China ought to think a little more before it throws such heavy weight around and be more confident of its development and its prowess. Does that do anything for you? Is that something that you think is important for China to participate in?
Absolutely. The phrase that we've heard in Southeast Asia is that China does not seek to be a hegemon in the region, let alone the world, and that China is going to rise to be a very different power from the United States. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen, particularly with regard to the South China Sea dispute, but on other issues as well, such as economic and trade ties with the United States and this wolf warrior diplomacy that you mentioned, Sarwar, we've seen China act or mirror its actions to the United States. And so disappointingly, China is starting to act like the United States in a number of ways.
Wow.
And I find that somewhat disturbing because there's obviously a disconnect between rhetoric and reality.
Wow.
And so if China can sort of distance itself from this action-reaction mode in its conduct of ties with the United States, then I would urge Chinese friends to just step back and think about how that reflects to the rest of the world. Because what we're seeing essentially in some cases is the Chinese acting quite similarly to the Americans.
Well, Ms. Noor, we've alas run out of time. I want to thank you so very much for that timely and instructive conversation and also a forthright conversation. And I hope you'll come back and see us again. And thank you also to our viewers around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the impact of the U.S. presidential elections on the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China and its impact on the world. Until then, goodbye.